July 30th, 1943. Dawn over RAF Kimbolton was a muted gray, the kind that settled low across the airfield and wrapped itself around the B-17s like a warning. Crews moved quietly across the dispersal points, the smell of oil, exhaust, and damp canvas hanging heavy in the air. Today's target, Kassel, Germany. A deep strike, a dangerous one. Every man on the 527th Bomb Squadron knew the Luftwaffe would be waiting. Staff Sergeant Michael Arooth walked toward his aircraft, B-17 Tondelayo, helmet tucked under one arm, his other hand brushing the frost from the tail guns as if greeting an old friend. The tail position was the loneliest seat in the sky. No one behind you, nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Just twin .50 caliber Brownings, a narrow glass dome, and miles of open air filled with enemies. His crew knew him as calm, steady, almost unervingly composed. But that morning, Arooth carried a tension in his shoulders he couldn't shake. Something told him this mission would be different. He could feel it before they even started the engines. At briefing, the intel officer pointed to the map. A direct route over enemy territory, heavy fighter response expected. Messerschmitt Bf-109s had been increasing head-on and tail-end attacks in coordinated groups, quick, precise, and deadly. Remember your training. Hold fire until 600 yards, the officer said, tapping the board for emphasis. Ammo discipline saves lives. Arooth didn't react, but the word stayed with him. Hours later, at 20,000 feet over Germany, contrails spread across the sky like white scars. The bomber stream stretched for miles. The radio crackled with nervous chatter. Then a warning shout. Bandits! 6 o'clock low. Arooth swung his guns down and saw them. Bf-109s, tight formation, climbing fast. His fingers tightened around the triggers. He knew what he was supposed to do. Wait. Let them close. Let them get inside 600 yards where the .50 caliber rounds had real stopping power. But something felt wrong. The German formation was precise, too precise. They weren't just approaching. They were preparing to break into coordinated attack passes, the kind that overwhelmed bomber defenses with speed and synchronization. 600 yards would be too late. At 900 yards, more than 4 times the distance considered effective, Arooth opened fire. Long, controlled bursts. Not panicked, not wasteful. His crew shouted through the intercom, "What the hell are you doing, Mike?" But Arooth didn't answer. He was watching for something else entirely. The Bf-109 formation reacted immediately, and that reaction changed everything. Morning sunlight broke thin and cold across the English countryside as Tondelayo lifted off from Kimbolton. Inside the tail compartment, Michael Arooth settled into his metal and glass cage. It was the loneliest position on the aircraft, 50 feet behind the rest of the crew, isolated, exposed, and the first to see death coming. He checked the twin .50 caliber Brownings the same way he always did. Feed trays aligned, charging handles smooth, ammunition belts running clean through the guides. Nothing unusual, nothing remarkable, except for the thought he'd been carrying for weeks. A quiet, private rebellion against everything he had been taught. Gunnery school instructors drilled the same rule into every man who touched a .50. Don't fire beyond 600 yards. You'll just waste ammunition. At longer distances, the dispersion pattern widened, the rounds traced unpredictable spirals, and pilots could evade easily. Every manual, every blackboard diagram, every combat lecture reinforced it. But Arooth had been watching the Germans. Carefully. He had studied the timing of their approaches, the rhythm of their turns, the speed at which Bf-109s dove through the bomber formations. And something about it gnawed at him. They were too coordinated, too confident, too synchronized in their closing passes. Fighters didn't just attack a bomber. They attacked as a team, lining up into a pattern, diving one after another like blades of a spinning saw. If the first fighter succeeded, the second was already committed. If the first was driven off, the second still came. And the third, and the fourth. It wasn't about hitting them at long range. It was about breaking their timing. At briefing that morning, intelligence warned of heavy Luftwaffe resistance near Kassel. The 379th Bomb Group would be in the middle of the formation, a magnet for coordinated attacks. Most gunners tightened their belts and muttered curses. Arooth simply filed the words away. He knew what he wanted to try, and he knew he couldn't tell a soul, because no gunner, not one, wanted to be known as the man who wasted ammo before the enemy was even in range. So he strapped in, closed the hatch behind him, looked through his glass dome into the empty sky, and prepared to break the rule every gunner lived by. The formation crossed the Dutch coast at altitude, where the cold was sharp enough to sting through heated gloves. From the tail, Arooth watched the long silver procession stretch across the sky. A chain of B-17s glinting like mirrors in the sun. Contrails braided behind them, white ropes twisting in the blue. At first, the ride was calm. The interphone crackled with the routine chatter of a crew settling into the hours-long rhythm of a deep strike mission. The navigator called headings. The pilot adjusted throttle. The engineer checked fuel flow. Nothing unusual, until Arooth's voice cut through, low and steady. Fighters forming up at 6 o'clock. Far. No one else could see them yet. Only the tail gunner had that view. The world unfolding behind the bomber like a stage where every threat made its entrance. Tiny specks at first, moving with purpose, gathering, aligning. The Luftwaffe. Within minutes, those specks spread into a loose arc, then tightened. Arooth recognized the silhouettes. Long noses, squared wings, angular tails. Messerschmitt Bf-109s. Dozens. Too many for a single pass. They were setting up something bigger. Inside the bomber, tension prickled. The waist gunners swung their guns outboard. The top turret rotated. The radio operator listened for warning calls from nearby crews. Everyone was scanning for the attack. But Arooth wasn't scanning. He was measuring, estimating distance the way some men felt temperature, instinctively, intuitively, without needing to think. He watched the spacing between German fighters tighten into the familiar attack funnel. One line diving in, the second banking wide to reset for another run. A perfect machine, a perfect rhythm, and rhythms could be broken. He steadied his breathing. His gloved finger hovered near the butterfly triggers. 900 yards, twice the recommended opening distance. 3 seconds too early, according to every training film ever shot at Wendover Field. Not today. Arooth squeezed. The twin Brownings howled, spitting fire into the open sky. A stream of tracers arced out, brilliant red lines carving across the empty air long before the fighters were in lethal range. Inside the interphone, the crew erupted. "Mike, what are you doing? Hold your fire. Save your ammo." But the German formation reacted instantly. The lead 109 jerked sideways, disrupting his dive angle. The second flared wide. The neat, synchronized attack pattern wobbled as pilots tried to avoid the unexpected long-range fire. For the first time that day, the saw blade lost its rhythm. The B-17 shuddered as slipstreams collided along its tail, but Arooth barely felt it. His world had narrowed to 2 machine guns, a glass blister, and a sky filled with enemies who suddenly didn't look so coordinated. His tracers cut across the gap like warning flares, not accurate enough to hit at that distance, but accurate enough to force every German pilot to reconsider his next 2 seconds. 2 seconds in aerial combat was a lifetime. The 109s hesitated. Their clean, disciplined attack geometry fractured as each pilot adjusted independently. No longer moving as a single lethal organism, but as individuals trying to avoid a stream of long-range fire no textbook had prepared them for. And in that moment, Arooth saw it clearly. He wasn't shooting to destroy them. He was shooting to disrupt them. Inside the bomber, the arguments raged. That's ammo waste. He's firing blind. Someone get him to stop. But then something happened that no one could argue with. The first 109 in the outer ring broke away too early, forced wide by Arooth's tracers. The second pulled up rather than into the perfect dive angle. The third clipped turbulence from the sudden maneuver of the first 2 and wobbled sideways. Their timing gone. Their spacing sloppy. Their attack line shattered. The waist gunner watched the chaos unfold and muttered, almost in disbelief. He's throwing off their whole run. The pilot, hearing the tone shift, asked for clarity. What's happening back there? Arooth answered calmly, as if he weren't rewriting bomber doctrine in real time. They're not lining up. I'm keeping them guessing. Another burst rattled through the airframe. The heavy thunk 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 of .50 caliber fire traveled like a heartbeat through the fuselage. More tracers reached across the sky, and again the Germans flinched, scattering just enough to break the synchronized attack pass they practiced endlessly. Only then did the first fighter commit to a run, a sloppy, misaligned dive from the wrong angle, far from ideal. The top turret opened up. The waist guns joined. Instead of a perfectly timed head-on assault that would tear through the formation, the 109 came in alone, vulnerable, and was driven off by defensive fire. The interphone went silent. No one questioned Arooth now. They were all too busy watching something impossible unfold. One tail gunner, using a technique every instructor dismissed as reckless, was forcing the Luftwaffe to improvise. And improvisation meant mistakes. Mistakes the flying fortresses could survive. The bomb group pushed deeper toward Kassel, contrails twisting above them like white ropes pulled tight across the sky. The Luftwaffe regrouped. They always did. Discipline was their advantage, and the 109s reformed with the cold precision of men who had made a science of killing bombers. But now every fighter in the next wave carried a new problem: uncertainty. They had seen the tracers reach out before the official engagement zone. They had watched the first runs break apart simply because one gunner refused to follow the rules. And in aerial combat, doubt was contagious. Arooth watched them return. 6 fighters, stacked in a climbing arc from low to high. The classic Luftwaffe clamshell attack. Textbook, deadly, usually unstoppable. He steadied his breathing, placing his feet against the tail bulkhead for balance as the guns vibrated beneath him. His sight picture hovered over the lead fighter's nose, still too far for doctrinal engagement. He fired anyway. The long-range burst reached across the sky, thin and bright like a wire being drawn between them. The lead 109 jerked left. The second dipped low. The perfect arc shattered again. Inside the cockpit, the pilot yelled over the engines, "Arooth, you're breaking them up before they even commit." But Arooth didn't answer. He was too busy tracking the next pair of fighters, firing again, pushing them wider, forcing them to stagger their timing. The waist gunner leaned toward the window, watching carefully. "He's not trying to hit them," he said quietly. "He's shaping the attack." The bombardier, normally silent during fighter passes, added, "Never seen anything like it." Then something happened that no one expected. One of the German fighters, forced into an early, sloppy break, drifted too close to another 109, trying to correct. Their wings nearly touched, and both were forced to abort the run entirely to avoid collision. The formation dissolved into a chaotic spray of fighters, each improvising, each adjusting alone. This time, the B-17 wasn't a corner target. It was the center of an expanding disturbance. The top turret and waist guns unleashed overlapping fire. A 109 diving at a bad angle took a burst through the fuselage and spiraled downward, trailing smoke. Another misjudged his speed and overshot, exposing his belly to every gun on the right side of the bomber. The interphone crackled. "Hale, keep doing exactly what you're doing." Arooth didn't smile, didn't celebrate. He simply watched, patient and calm, as the fighters reset yet again. Now visibly frustrated, because in the skies over Germany, one gunner had just broken the first rule of bomber defense. He was dictating their moves. The German counterattacks came faster now, angrier, less coordinated. The pilots were adapting, searching for a rhythm that Arooth couldn't disrupt, but every attempt collapsed under the same unexpected pressure. Long-range fire they were never trained to handle. Arooth tracked 3 fighters approaching from the low 6, climbing into firing position. They were learning, closing in closer before committing, try to slip under his extended reach. The lead pilot held his line, determined not to flinch early this time. Arooth opened fire at 950 yards, even farther than before. The tracers stretched across the sky in a white arc. The Germans banked instinctively, but the lead pilot forced himself back onto the attack vector. He was fighting two battles now, the bomber in front of him and the fear creeping up his spine. The second fighter wasn't so disciplined. He broke first. That single break ruined the attack for all three. The third pilot, positioned to mirror the second's climb rate, suddenly lost visual alignment. The lead fighter drifted into the wrong angle, and the carefully constructed three-ship assault dissolved in seconds. Inside Tondelayo, the crew saw it happen and couldn't believe their eyes. "That's 3 attack runs ruined," the radio operator muttered. "Never seen the 109s this sloppy," the waist gunner added. But the Germans were far from done. 2 fighters dove from the high 12, using a sun-angle approach to blind the gunners. A textbook move, a brutal one. The top turret called it out too late for comfort. The sun flashed directly through the cockpit glass, washing the nose crew in white glare. They were vulnerable. Arooth saw the angle. He couldn't hit the fighters from the tail, too steep, too far forward. But he could influence their timing. He fired anyway. His tracers arced upward at an absurd trajectory, nowhere near the incoming fighters, but perfectly visible. The lead 109 pilot, expecting to dive cleanly into a blind spot, now faced unexpected fire coming from a direction no bomber manual accounted for. He hesitated. His wingman clipped his turbulence. The dive lost alignment. And in that instant of hesitation, the top turret reacquired visual through the glare and unleashed a perfect burst. The wingman peeled off smoking. The lead fighter aborted entirely. Arooth exhaled slowly. This was the moment the crew understood the truth. He wasn't firing early out of panic. He wasn't ignoring training because he was reckless. He was thinking faster than the enemy. He was reshaping the battle before it reached them. And for the first time since the raid had begun, someone in the cockpit said what everyone was thinking but hadn't dared to voice. He might have just found a whole new way to defend a bomber. The bomber stream pushed on toward Kassel, the air filling with the distant thunder of flak ahead and the lingering echoes a machine gun burst behind. The formation tightened instinctively. Every pilot in the group had seen the German attacks falter around Tondelayo. Word spread over interplane radios and fragments. Tail gunner firing early, disrupting attack runs. Messerschmitts not coordinating. No one knew the full story yet, but every bomber behind them could see the effects. The Luftwaffe reappeared for another massed assault, this one larger, more desperate. A swarm of dark shapes rose from cloud shadow. 12, then 15, then 18 fighters converging on the rear of the formation. This was no test run. This was a kill sweep. Arooth adjusted in his tiny metal cage, the cold wind leaking through bullet holes around the tail cone. His hands hovered over the butterfly triggers, but he didn't fire immediately. Timing mattered. He needed the Germans fully committed, fully focused on aligning their run, before he broke the whole formation apart again. The fighters formed a tightening funnel behind the bombers, a spiraling pattern meant to collapse into a simultaneous assault. Perfect German doctrine. Clean. Deadly. Arooth's breathing slowed. 950 yards. 900. 880. He squeezed the triggers. The .50 caliber guns roared, sending a stream of tracers like a thrown spear straight down the funnel's throat. The very shape of the formation unraveled. The lead German rolled left. The second yanked upward too hard. The third banked the wrong direction and nearly collided with his wingman. The entire assault disintegrated into individual, uncoordinated dives. Inside Tondelayo, the waist gunners were speechless. Jesus, he broke the whole group. The radio operator whispered, "They can't get a clean pass. They can't even form up." The top turret joined in, picking off a fighter forced into an off-angle dive. Another German, correcting from a sudden evasive maneuver, exposed his underside at the wrong moment and was torn open by converging fire from 3 bombers. Arooth kept firing, not randomly, not wildly. Every long burst was placed where it would shape the battle, where it would make enemy pilots react, hesitate, second guess. He was fighting psychology as much as aerodynamics. The Germans tried again and again to regroup into disciplined formations, but every attempt was shattered by early fire that threw off timing, spacing, and courage. Nothing in the manuals had prepared them for this. By the seventh disrupted attack, the Luftwaffe pilots changed tactics entirely, switching to single, independent runs, something the 8th Air Force rarely saw because it was so inefficient. But inefficiency was all they had left. The formation finally neared Kassel, and every bomber still flying knew why. Over Kassel, the sky transformed from a battlefield into a furnace. Columns of black flak erupted upward in towering bursts, shaking Tondelayo with every near hit. The formation contracted into a tight, trembling box, each crew praying their wings would hold through the barrage. But even in the chaos of anti-aircraft fire, the fighter threat didn't disappear. They returned. Out of the haze on the far side of the city, the Luftwaffe rose again, fewer this time, but hardened by frustration. Their attacks had failed repeatedly, but they weren't finished. The Germans positioned themselves for a final, decisive blow as the bombers left the target area. Arooth felt the shift before he saw it. The sky behind them darkened with climbing aircraft. 6 fighters, then 8, then 10. They weren't coming in a spread. They were forming a stacked scissor, a rotating staircase of fighters designed to break apart a bomber's rear guns with alternating passes. It was a coordinated maneuver, one that required precise timing, not chaos. The Germans were betting that discipline would finally overcome Arooth's disruption. Arooth adjusted his harness, wiped sweat from his eyes, and waited. The funnel tightened. The lead 109 tilted slightly to correct his angle. That was all the cue he needed. He opened fire at 1,000 yards. The tracers reached the German formation before their attack geometry fully matured, slicing through the air like a line drawn through their diagram. The top fighter banked away too soon. The next in line overcorrected downward. The entire staircase collapsed as pilots scrambled to avoid colliding in their spiraling descent. The interphone lit up with stunned reactions. They're pulling out before they even engage. This is insane. He's rewriting their approach. The top turret called out, 2 fighters diving right. They're not aligned, and they weren't. The disrupted Germans came individually now, forced into panicked, unsynchronized dives. The first screamed in too fast, too shallow, and the nose gunner ripped into his wing root. Another slipped sideways under Arooth's fire and exposed his tail to the left waist gun, which tore him apart at close range. Arooth kept firing, each stream of tracers placed where it would force a reaction, not necessarily strike metal. A third fighter dove wildly, misjudged his angle, and peeled off trailing smoke. He hadn't even fired a shot. By now, the transformation was complete. Arooth wasn't just defending his bomber. He was shaping the battlefield around it. Every German fighter came in alone. Every attack was rushed. Every pass was compromised before it even began. It was no longer a coordinated assault. It was a collapsing experiment. The bombers began leaving Kassel behind, leveling off into open sky. And in the tale of Tondelayo, Staff Sergeant Michael Arooth understood, for the first time, that he had just done something no gunnery manual had ever imagined. He had turned long-range fire, a technique dismissed as wasteful, into a weapon that broke the enemy's mind before it broke their aircraft. Tail to crew, Arooth said quietly. They're falling back. The Luftwaffe finally began to fade behind the retreating bomber stream. Their formations scattered, their discipline frayed. Tondelayo shuddered from flak damage and wind shear, but she held together, her crew exhausted and stunned into an uneasy quiet. Arooth remained at his guns, scanning the sky, unwilling to believe the Germans were finished. Then he saw them, for fighters, stragglers, angry and desperate, clawing their way back toward the formation. They weren't part of an organized unit anymore. Their spacing was irregular, their angles sloppy. These were hunters acting on instinct, not doctrine. And instinct was easier to break. Arooth adjusted his guns, the familiar metallic clack echoing through the tail. He waited, not for distance this time, but for commitment. The Germans had learned that he would fire early, so they stayed loose, unpredictable. But unpredictability came with its own flaws. One fighter tried a shallow climbing attack under the fuselage. Arooth couldn't hit him, but he could shape the run. He fired long bursts not at the plane itself, but into the empty air just ahead of its projected path. The German hesitated. That one heartbeat slowed his timing enough that the ball turret caught him during the climb and stitched fire across his engine. The 109 fell away, trailing black smoke. 3 left. The next came from high and right, using a slashing pass designed to overwhelm the right waist gunner. But the gunner had spent the whole mission watching Arooth's technique. He fired early, not on target, but in anticipation. The fighter jerked left, startled. The right waist gun adjusted instantly, caught the new vector, and hammered the German's wing. The 109 rolled violently and spun out of the fight. 2 left. The remaining fighters hesitated, just long enough for the top turret and left waist gun to synchronize. The sky erupted in a crossfire that the lone attackers couldn't break through. After a few scattered, hopeless attempts, the last pair rolled away, diving toward cloud cover. "Tail, they're withdrawing," the navigator said softly. Arooth exhaled for the first time in minutes. But he kept scanning, always scanning. Only then did the inner phone crackle with something unexpected. "Tail, what exactly were you doing back there? I've never seen fighters break off like that." Arooth didn't answer immediately. He wasn't sure how to explain it. How do you describe something no manual had ever taught? How do you put into words a technique discovered by instinct, pressure, and survival? Finally, he said, "I wasn't trying to kill them. Not at first." The crew waited. "I was trying to ruin their attack before it started." Silence filled the bomber, because everyone knew the truth. He hadn't just defended Tondelayo. He had defended bombers in front of them, behind them, across the entire formation. And somewhere behind the thinning clouds of Kassel, the Germans were still trying to figure out what had gone wrong. Arooth sat back against the cold metal frame of the tail, hands steady on the grips, eyes still locked on the shrinking horizon. He didn't need confirmation. He knew. Tondelayo limped south with the bomber stream, her aluminum skin rattling from flak holes that whistled in the slipstream. The sun was lowering now, turning the sky a dull silver. Most missions ended with relief, the kind of tired quiet that settles in once you've outrun the danger. But today, the formation wasn't quiet. Everyone was talking about the tail gunner. From cockpit to waist positions, the interphones buzzed with disbelief. Did you see how early he fired? He broke entire runs on his own. Never seen the 109 scatter like that. Even bombers from neighboring squadrons chimed in over the group frequency. Ship in the lead element, who was firing at extreme range. That tail saved our skins on the 3rd pass. Arooth listened, but he didn't speak. He stayed in the tail, still scanning for stragglers, still gripping the twin .50s. His arms ached. His fingers trembled from vibration. He had fired more rounds that day than any tail gunner in the group. But he wasn't thinking about records. He was thinking about patterns. The Germans didn't break because of long-range hits. They broke because their minds weren't prepared for the unexpected. Doctrine had drilled precision into them. Tight formations, perfect spacing, coordinated timing. A threatening beauty when executed correctly. He had turned that precision against them. The pilot finally called back, his voice tight but thick with something like wonder. "Tail, you still with us?" "Still here," Arooth answered. "What you did today, you scrambled every fighter that came near us. You realized that." Arooth didn't reply. He kept watching the sky. What mattered wasn't pride. It was understanding. He had seen how early suppressive fire didn't just interrupt a single plane. It forced corrections that cascaded through an entire formation. Every pilot adjusting for another's panic. Every spacing thrown off. Every timing broken. A chain reaction caused by a single, unexpected variable. And if it worked once, it could work always. As Tondelayo neared the English Channel, the sun filtering through the clouds in pale streaks, a message crackled through the radio from another bomber in the group. to the tail gunner who opened up at 900 yards. "Whatever you did, do it again tomorrow." The radio operator chuckled. "Tail, you've got fans now." But Arooth only leaned forward, resting his forehead against the cold glass of the tail blister. He didn't care about fans. He cared about the realization settling heavily in his chest. He hadn't just bent the rules. He had broken the unwritten ones. The ones fighter pilots relied on for predictability, timing, and lethal repetition. He had found something new, something dangerous, something no manual had prepared for. And somewhere behind him, far across Germany, Luftwaffe pilots were still arguing in ready rooms, trying to understand why their perfect geometry had fallen apart the moment one tail gunner refused to wait for 600 yards. "Tail to crew," Arooth finally said, voice low and steady. Skies still clear. But inside, he knew nothing about this mission would ever be the same. Back over England, the bomber stream began its slow descent toward Kimbolton. Exhausted crews exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others laughing nervously at the chaos they'd survived. Yet every pair of eyes eventually drifted to Tondelayo's tail. Every gunner in the 379th Bomb Group had witnessed something extraordinary, a tail gunner who ignored every rule they had learned and emerged not only unscathed but victorious. Arooth's hands ached, his shoulders stiffened from holding the guns steady for hours. Sweat and grime streaked his face, but he remained alert. The threat might be gone, but instinct didn't switch off that quickly. He scanned the horizon, eyes moving from cloud to contrail, from shadow to glint of metal. Years of training had honed him to anticipate, to calculate, to survive, but today, instinct had merged with observation to create something entirely new. The crew began discussing what had happened, hushed at first, then louder as the shock wore off. "Did you see him at 900 yards? He was shaping their runs. Every pass they tried to make, he threw it off." Even the pilot, who had flown countless missions over Europe, leaned back in his seat, awing his voice. "Staff Sergeant, that tail of yours. I don't know if anyone's ever done that before." Arooth said nothing. He didn't need praise. He knew the real measure of his success lay not in their awe, but in the fact that every B-17 in the group had survived when previous raids over Kassel had been far deadlier. The effectiveness of a single gunner firing outside the rules had proven more valuable than dozens of conventional gunners adhering to doctrine. The lesson was clear. Innovation under pressure could save lives in ways doctrine could not anticipate. Later, in debriefing, officers scratched notes in their reports, trying to quantify the impact of the Kassel raid. Arooth's actions were noted, but not fully understood. Some questioned his decision to fire early. Others praised the unorthodox success. The fact remained, though, his unconventional approach had disrupted enemy fighters in a way manuals could not explain. Whispers spread through the 379th Bomb Group. Gunnery crews began experimenting subtly on subsequent missions. Tail gunners tested longer ranges. Engagement timing was adjusted. The concept of suppressive fire at extended range became a topic of discussion. Controversial, dangerous, yet undeniably effective. By the time Tondelayo touched down at Kimbolton, the sun was sinking low, painting the sky in muted reds and golds. Crews walked off the tarmac, exhausted but alive, carrying the silent knowledge that something had changed that day. Michael Arooth didn't celebrate. He packed up his gear, slung the empty ammo boxes onto the trolley, and quietly exited the aircraft, leaving behind a lesson that would ripple through bomber warfare forever. In the days following the Kassel mission, word of Arooth's long-range technique spread quietly through the 8th Air Force. It wasn't in any training manual. It wasn't an official doctrine. It was a whisper among gunners, a piece of battlefield wisdom passed from tail to tail, crew to crew. Those who had flown alongside Tondelayo carried the memory of the mission like a secret weapon. Every bomber that went over German skies afterward included subtle adjustments. Fire discipline rethought, engagement timing reconsidered, the concept of shaping enemy behavior embraced cautiously, but with growing confidence. Arooth's instinct had become experimental doctrine. Historians would later call it a turning point in defensive bomber tactics. The principle was deceptively simple. Disrupt before contact, force mistakes, exploit hesitation. And yet, the courage to act against training was rare. Arooth had demonstrated that survival often depended on judgment, intuition, and the willingness to challenge the rules. In the 527th Bomb Squadron, tail gunners studied each other, watching, listening, and learning from his technique. Arooth himself returned to the tail gunner position on subsequent raids, refining his method, adjusting ranges, and continuing to shape attacks before the Germans could coordinate. His actions directly influenced bomber survivability and the morale of crews flying deep into hostile skies. Back at Camp Bolton, after the mission debrief, he sat quietly in the mess hall, the din of conversation around him, yet feeling apart. He didn't need accolades. He understood that the mission's success was measured in lives saved and bombers returned, not medals or praise. Yet the legacy of that July 30th mission endured. Within weeks, other crews were experimenting with early engagement, carefully observing results and sharing techniques. Arooth's innovation became the basis of informal tactical discussions that would shape bomber operations for the rest of the war. By the end of World War II, the idea that tail gunners could actively disrupt enemy formations at extended ranges had entered the collective knowledge of bomber groups across Europe. What had begun as one man's split-second decision in the sky over Kassel evolved into a subtle but vital evolution in aerial combat. Michael Arooth retired to civilian life after the war, quiet and unassuming. Few ever knew the full extent of his contribution. But in every tactical briefing, in every lesson passed down from veteran gunners to new recruits, his principle lived on. Sometimes breaking the rules was the only way to save lives and change history. The story of Tondelayo and the tail gunner who fired early became legend, not because it followed the manual, but because it rewrote it in midair.